Welcome back. It's your boy, Mr. Cummings. We're going to be tackling APUSH Period 6 today, 1865 to 1898. So we'll be looking at industrialization, urbanization, the Gilded Age, a little bit of westward expansion, all kinds of stuff prepping us for the 20th century. So, as usual, let's get it. Let's go. So our context for this period, beginning in 1865, would be the conclusion of the Civil War, a new America which will be built with the industrialization, settling the West. There's been a long process ever since we first showed up in Jamestown. Economics going back, comparing and contrasting the market revolution to the industrial revolution of the later half of the 19th century, continuity change over time, cause effect of 19th century industrialization, immigration concerns. We've had the Irish, the Germans, we'll get the Eastern and Southern Europeans during this time period. Labor issues, labor unions see a resurgence during this time period. You had Commonwealth v. Hunt in Massachusetts making unions legal. You had the early rise of that with the market revolution. And then again, continuing political parties. We saw the Republican Party get formed right at the beginning of the Civil War. Names won't change, Republicans, Democrats, but the issues change as we go into a new political party system as well. So stuff we've already covered, lending into period 6 as we will continue and then deepen a lot of these trends. So we mentioned it early on, one of the big takeaways from period 6 is this rise of industrialization. The United States will become one of the leading and then ultimately the leading industrial country in the world during this time period. And that will largely be done on the backs of railroads. So railroads, when in doubt, railroads. They're just that important to the growth of America. They're going to grow out of the eastern lines. The railroads been around 1830s, 1840s. You see a big kind of building of them in the Northeast, and that's what connects them to the Midwest states, so connecting New York to Ohio, for example. And then during the 1850s, 1860s, we will then begin construction of what's called a transcontinental railroad going across the continent. And that will link east to west. And it's going to come at a time when gold's been discovered in California in 1848, 1849. The Rockies are going to be very mineral rich. Arizona will have silver, different places like that, copper, lead, all of these raw materials that you're going to need to fuel the industrial engines, which are growing back east. The government will subsidize this. They will give massive land grants to railroad companies to incentivize them to go out and build this. And then this also will lead to things like the Chinese Exclusion Act on the West Coast. As the railroad demand for jobs increases, California's population begins to grow. You see a lot of Asian immigration. You see the subsequent rise of nativism, the Kearneyites, different guys like that don't want Chinese immigration. That's the big country that's sending a lot of Asian immigration is China. And so you pass the Chinese Exclusion Act to limit and ultimately eliminate unskilled Chinese immigration. To the benefit of the American worker is the attitude of the day. The other thing the railroads will have a very significant impact on will be the Native Americans, because now the Army can get out there much more efficiently, and then settlers are coming behind the Army, and they're going to start taking the land and whittling down the reservation system over and over again. So ultimately, the railroads do spell that. The railroads and the end of the buffalo and the decimation of the buffalo spell the end for the Native Americans. So here are just two maps showing you the difference in railroad construction in just 20 years. You've got 1870, just that one transcontinental railroad with a good chunk of it in the Midwest and the Northeast, and then compare that to 1890, and you can see the explosion of railroad construction that occurs during this time period. So if railroads are connecting us and they're allowing efficient movement of goods and things like that, you have the other industries that are growing too. So we'll look at Carnegie's steel empire and then Rockefeller's oil empire. Those are the two big names worth mentioning, and we'll kind of go over them very quickly. So steel, this allows the railroads to be constructed. It's cheaper, it's stronger, lasts longer. Once Carnegie figures out the Bessemer process, which is taken from England, which is a more efficient way of transforming iron ore into steel, this allows steel production to explode across the country. It allows cities to go vertical. You need the plate glass, the steel elevators to build the vertical skeletons of the skyscrapers. And Carnegie is able to build a massive steel empire, a monopoly, through what's called vertical integration. We'll look at the difference between vertical and horizontal integration on the next slide, but it's a way of building a monopoly, basically. And Carnegie is also the author of The Gospel of Wealth. And basically, this is the attitude that it's the God-given responsibility for the wealthy to be philanthropic, to do charity work in cities for the benefit of of society. So this is why you see Carnegie Hall and the libraries and all these different things. It's not a handout. It's not welfare. It's I'm going to use my wealth to create the opportunities for you to become better, grow your life, etc. And all of these guys, a lot of these guys do this. Carnegie is the biggest one. Gospel of Wealth, Andrew Carnegie. There you go. Oil is Rockefeller. So Rockefeller is able to figure out that kerosene can be refined from oil, and that becomes his largest product that he makes early on. And then into the 20th century, he's able to pivot to gasoline once the automobiles become a thing with Henry Ford. So that'd be another guy worth mentioning in the 20th century. Rockefeller uses horizontal integration, will form the nation's first trust, the Standard Oil Trust. And both of these guys, and pretty much all of industry during this time period, is following laissez-faire. Very important phrase. If you're writing an essay about industrialization, definitely drop in laissez-faire. It's little government regulation of the economy, kind of hands off. It's just the government doesn't do much to say industries can and cannot do this. There's not environmental policies really during this time period, anything like that. And then social Darwinism is another term associated with this time period in these guys. And you take Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and you apply it to businesses and then even people. And this idea is that natural selection will apply to businesses and society, that the smarter, more innovative people will rise, the more successful companies will survive, and then the market, the economy, will select those that are not efficient, those that do not provide a good product, service, or whatever for extinction, right, to go out of business. So this also then gets applied to people, and so there'll be certain, groups of people that are more favored than others, and so minorities, Native Americans, women, stuff like that might find themselves lower on the totem pole. Out of this, eventually, will grow eugenics in the late 18th and then late 19th, early 20th century, and that's the idea that we're going to be racial superiority. We only want certain groups to reproduce, etc. And it gets really nasty really fast, and the Nazis will take that and run with it to give you an idea of where that kind of social Darwinism aspect ultimately ends up. And during this time period, it does fuel a lot of the decisions that are made and is a powerful kind of influencer on society alongside that idea of laissez-faire. The government just doesn't get involved in any of this. So here is the difference between vertical and horizontal integration. So on the left, it's the cattle industry, but if you want to use Carnegie's steel, it doesn't really matter, right? What the industry is, it's just vertical integration. You own every step of the process, every level from taking it from the raw material to whatever the finished good is. You own every tier of that. So here you can see the cattle example. If it was steel, you'd start with the iron ore, and then you'd own the railroad, and you'd own the refinery or the mills to make iron into steel, and then the steel sellers and all of that. So it goes just up. So if you think of it as the raw material is the first floor, the finished product is the top floor, that's a vertical integration. Rockefeller does horizontal integration. So Carnegie does vertical, Rockefeller does horizontal. Rockefeller's strategy is to try to take over one entire level of that vertical process. So if it's oil, right, you would have the oil derricks pulling oil from the ground, then the piping to transport it, the railroads, the refineries, and then the distributors. Rockefeller's going to own all the refineries out of that. So he ends up ultimately at his peak about 90% of the oil refineries in the country. And so that gives him a lot of power because you're controlling basically a chokehold. Everybody's got to go through you, and then you make a ton of money that way. Whereas Carnegie on vertical integration owns it all from cradle to grave, and then he doesn't have to pay anybody else, so he can cut costs that way. Both guys use both, honestly, but Carnegie's vertical, Rockefeller's horizontal. It's enough to just drop these into an essay if you're writing about, like, Rockefeller, through the use of horizontal integration, will form the nation's first trust, Standard Oil Trust, blah, 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 blah. You're off to the races, and you'll be good to go. So we also have a number of inventions that come out during this time period as well that further increase efficiency in industry. So electricity is a big one. You've got Thomas Edison and the light bulb. So what this does is this actually frees up and unchains humanity from the sun. We can now work at night with greater efficiency. Factories aren't limited by when the sun sets. It's too dark to see inside. This is a huge threat to Rockefeller since we're using kerosene lamps before. So Rockefeller has to pivot around this type of stuff. Electricity will make cities safer. You can light up the cities now, which can reduce crime, increase visibility, things like that. So a lot of effects of electricity. Think about your lives today and how electricity is in pretty much everything for the most part. Graham Bell with the telephone. So we go from the telegraph to the telephone. Graham Bell also does the phonograph, so that makes music portable with your records and stuff like that to a certain degree. So that's an impact on culture. But the telephone greatly increases real-time communication, increases efficiency, reduces waste and mistakes and stuff like that. So if you were comparing and contrasting or continuity and change the market revolution with the industrial revolution, bring up the inventions, bring up, Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts and cotton gin and that kind of stuff. Talk about their effects on society, and then do the same for this time period. Electricity, telephone, things like that. You in the 20th century, you'll have Henry Ford, with the automobile with the assembly line. You could add that in there too, depending on the time period. Marketing changes. So Macy's, right? Macy's department stores, we get that, where you can go into one building and do a bunch of different things. Sears and Roebuck use the railroad with mail order catalogs, which is a major invention there. New advertisements show up for this as well, because again, we're starting to make a bunch of more products. So we want people to buy them. Meat packing, Gustavus Swift is the name you want to use with that. He'll take advantage of refrigerated rail cars, and then canning technology for food safety preservation, stuff like that. Makes it a little bit easier to take the cattle that you're driving up from Texas and then get them to the New York, restaurants and stuff like that. So these are all just examples of inventions that are going on that change society and change the way we live life, which always is a great topic to talk about if it's pertinent to your essay question. A lot of words on this slide, but it is an impact slide. And so if you had a question, analyze the effects of industrialization on American society from 1870 to 1930 or something, whatever the time period is, this would be a go-to money-making slide for you. We are the leading industrial power. That helps our national identity of hard work and pull yourself up, etc. Wealth concentration does become a greater thing. The top 10% own 90% of the wealth, which doesn't leave a lot for those underneath. Going to create some economic instability for us going forward. Rags to riches stories are super popular, but exceedingly rare. Andrew Carnegie is an example of that. Shows up as an immigrant, doesn't really own a lot, very, very poor, dies one of the wealthiest Americans in history. So those are very popular. They still are to a certain degree today. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and work hard and keep your head down and stay diligent. You can be successful. The American dream stories are very much popular and become a thing during this time period. The middle class is actually kind of beginning to get created. As the industries grow, it's no longer just like the business owner is responsible for everything. Rockefeller will have refineries all across the country. It'll be an international business. That one individual, Rockefeller, can't be responsible for day-to-day issues. So he has managers, his vice presidents, and the divisions of companies get created. So you have sales, marketing, operations, and you create a management class whose whole job is to manage the workers and the workflow and all of that. Those guys get paid more money. So then those guys have more money to fund other jobs that aren't going to be associated with the oil industry or whatever. So doctors, lawyers, things like that, accountants, all of these different things will grow up alongside these big industries because more people have more money. All that being said, 2/3 of American workers in 1900 are wage workers, meaning they get paid a wage. Wages are low due to the labor supply. You have a lot of immigration during this time period. The Southern Eastern Europe immigration waves are happening, which means you have a large supply of available workers, and the demand is increasing with the large supply. So wages can stay low, because if you're like, well, hey, I want to get paid more money, the business owner can be like, all right, cool, because there'll be a boat full of more people coming off in an hour, and they're going to work for less money than you, so get out of here. So this is why we're going to see unions become a thing here in the next couple of slides as well. A lot of women end up working. Real wages do increase. Real income does increase. More people will have more money than ever before. But for women, it's single women in industries that were kind of viewed as an extension of the home. Textiles, garment industries, food production, things like that. House care, maids, all of that stuff if you're working outside the home. But once you got married and you had the money, then you were going to be a wife and a mother. If you're super poor, then you're going to keep working too, because again, you're getting paid so little money as these wage workers. But it sounds really bad, but the flip side is you could be starving to death on the Western farms, etc. So, it is progress, however small, but it does create a big foundation for the 20th century as well. So just keep that in mind. So we mentioned labor unions during the late 18th century. This time period sees the biggest activity of labor strife, strikes, and violence and all kinds of stuff. We touched on the population as those immigrants come in, which is our threat to unions. Unions will usually be anti-immigrant as well, because immigrants will work for less money than American workers. So employers have most of the power. They can lock you out. They can just close the factory. You're like, hey, we're going on strike. They can go, all right, cool, we're going to close the factory because Rockefeller can stand to lose money longer than you can as a wage worker. They'll blacklist you. Basically, this is a list of workers that are circulated amongst business owners of people not to hire. They'll force you to sign yellow dog contracts. These are where you, as the worker and part of your condition of employment, you agree not to be part of a union. They'll call in private security. They'll even get politics involved, use the state militia to come in, and they have access to the courts. These are all strategies business owners will use to keep the labor unions down. One of the biggest examples of a strike that's worth mentioning if you have an essay on labor unions or this time period is the Great Railroad Strike, which is in 1877. What else happens in 1877? That's right, Reconstruction ends. So a lot of stuff going on concurrently. 2/3 of the railroads get shut down. 500,000 other workers not directly for the railroads will join in as well. The president will actually use federal troops to end this strike, kill more than 100 people. And this really brings the labor concerns and the labor disputes to the forefront of the American consciousness. Remember, we talked about it. Railroads are super important. You shut down 2/3 of it, a lot of people are going to feel bad, whether you're in industry, transportation, whatever we're talking about. And then the violence of it is going to make the headlines, etc. So very, very contentious time period for labor unions. You can see the other two strikes there, Homestead strike, Pullman strike. One of the trends from this time is the government usually comes down on the side of industry. You have to get to the great coal miner strike in the early 20th century, 1903 with Teddy Roosevelt, before you see the government take a different approach. So if you're talking 1800s strikes, government conditions, government always comes down on the side of business and the business owners as opposed to the workers. So the big unions that we need to be aware of, the Knights of Labor, they're led by a guy named Terence Powderly. They are unique because they're an equal opportunity organization. Women, minorities can join. They're not segregated. They're anything like that. They're loosely organized, so it's hard to get like all of the different, branches of the union, if you want to call them that, to move in one direction. They're undone by the Haymarket bombing. That's the big thing we need to know. We need to know the Knights, Terence Powderly, allow everybody in, and then are undone by the Haymarket bombing. They get associated with it. There's some anarchists in the crowd. People get shot, blown up, bombs, all kinds of terrible stuff. So it kind of, in the consciousness of the Americans, they associate the labor union with a lot of this anarchy stuff, and it kind of is a big hit to the labor unions. The other big one is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers. These guys are a skilled labor union. Skilled labor still has more value during this time period, even as we are de-skilling labor because of machine technology, etc. But skilled labor still is more valuable. These guys stick to the phrase you want to use is bread and butter issues, like 8-hour workday, better conditions, more pay, stuff like that. Traditional union issues. They're not going to get political. When you get political, you're picking sides. They saw what happened to the Knights with the riots and all of that, and they're going to try to just do their thing. Now, they will ultimately be successful, but it will be in the 1900s. We talked about it just on the previous slide. Business owners have all the power. The other one worth mentioning, too, was on the other slide very briefly, was the American Railway Union. And the only reason that one's worth mentioning is because it's led by Eugene Debs, who is a big socialist guy, a socialist party, etc. And his name does crop up every now and then as another union leader. So Terence Powderly and the Knights, Samuel Gompers in the AFL, and then Debs and the ARU are three unions that would definitely earn you points for name dropping them in an essay. So we talked about the West. Well, what's going on out West? Well, there's a bunch of stuff getting discovered out there. Gold, silver, copper, lead, all those things we touched on already. Texas becomes a big state again. It is a big state, but you know what I'm saying. The ranching becomes big. The cattle drives are a thing for a little while. You can see on the picture on the left, you take the big cattle herds and you'll drive them north. Why are we going north? To the railroads, because the railroads are super important. And then the railroads will take them to the slaughterhouses in Cincinnati, Cleveland, places like that. And then the T-bone steaks end up on Rockefeller's plate back in New York, etc. This will be a kind of an age that lasts for a little bit of time, but is really going to be undone by property rights. Barbed wire would be the other example. Very, very cheap, efficient way of fencing in your property in a place where there's not a lot of trees. And so barbed wire will be very effective at ending the cattle drives as well. And then farming on the frontier is going to be very difficult. We've touched on the Homestead Act in the previous period. The idea where they give you a chunk of land, 150, 160 acres of land. You get it for relatively free. You live on it. You farm it for 5 years. It becomes yours. Very hard conditions. Once you get west of the 100th meridian, which is basically west of like Missouri-ish area, like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Dakotas, that part, the rainfall plummets in the country. So it becomes very, very difficult. You're building your homes out of sod, which are called soddies, or sod busters, were another name given to this group. You're dry farming, which is a technique where you dig deep enough into the soil where the natural water table is there, and you use that to try to germinate the seeds. The exodusters are part of this group. Remember, these were slaves that were trying to flee, or former slaves, excuse me, former slaves trying to flee the now free but very segregated South. And most of these are going to fail. Big business, big agricultural business becomes a thing. Your poor farmer can't afford the big machines that are being made, the reapers and the threshers and all of that. They're going to default on loans. The banks are going to take the land, etc. So it is an opportunity, a very limited opportunity, and it's just not going to be very successful. You can see about Jackson Turner's frontier thesis there. He had this whole idea that the frontier was very impactful in shaping this American identity. And as that frontier begins to close, what's going to happen? Is America going to fall apart? Obviously, we're not. We're going to go into the 20th century strong, but it is something that you could see as a document on a DBQ or something like that. So you can see it's explained there. Speaking of Native Americans, we've touched on them a couple of times. So you can see in the background image there all of the different forts and the battles which take place in what's known as the, quote, Plains Wars. But the reservation system is whittled down. This is the reason we're going to have the conflicts we're going to have with them. As we discover more resources, etc., those reservation systems quickly get stripped down smaller and smaller. The process has been going on from 1607, as pretty much as soon as the British showed up in Jamestown, and we'll ultimately come to a conclusion down there at that bottom bullet with Wounded Knee at 1890. Railroads, again, army, settlers, they'll have massive buffalo hunts that just kill off the buffalo, which is a lot of the north kind of, the plains natives way of life. You look at the Sioux, they're semi-nomadic, following the buffalo herds. The buffalo mean everything to them, not just for like physical clothing protection, but spiritualism, all kinds of stuff. So you start taking those out, you just start crushing those people in all phases that you can. Conflicts increases. You can see all the red on the map there. The big one that we would want to know is Little Bighorn. This is where the natives actually get a victory, because they smoke check Custer, Sand Creek Massacre, Fetterman Massacres, all kinds of different things. Ultimately, the trend here is that they're going to lose. The Dawes Act is an attempt to assimilate. Assimilate's a nice word to use if you're writing about the natives. And this idea is that they would kind of transform them into farmers. Big surprise, it's going to fail. They're not going to really get good land. It's going to get taken from them anyway. And if you are a Sioux and your whole way of life for generations has been to be moving around following the buffalo, you don't have generational knowledge of what it means to be a farmer and own land, et cetera, et cetera. So it will be successful for some, but largely a good rule of thumb, if you're writing on an essay or anything like that, is America's policies with regards to Native Americans is not going to be a good one. It's not going to be successful. And then Wounded Knee, again, the army catches them. Weapons get discharged and a bunch of women and children get killed. And it's just kind of this signifier as like, we can't keep fighting the army, right? It's just done. And it just kind of the resistance. And what you have seen throughout our course thus far before 1890 is over. So Tippecanoe, Fallen Timbers, all of these different things that, fights with the natives that we've had, done pretty much as we go into the 20th century. I know we have beaten this issue to death multiple times, but we're going to do it one more time just in case. The conservation movement does occur during this time period as well. The market revolution is not very environmentally friendly in the East. The Industrial Revolution is not the most environmentally friendly thing to have ever occurred. And as we've moved out west, we're like, wow, there's some really beautiful places out there. We should probably try to save them. Yellowstone, one of the first, 1872. Yosemite Valley, one of the most visited parks in the 21st century today, is 1890. Conservation, preservation. Conservation is you manage and regulate the use of resources. Preservation is you don't use them at all, you just leave them alone. So you see John Muir, preservation. You see guys like Teddy Roosevelt, conservation, okay? And you can see some pictures there and look how beautiful it's like with postcards and it's all kinds of gorgeous stuff. Glad we saved it so we can enjoy it today. Preservation versus conservation. So industrialization is going on in the north, transportation, settlements going on in the west. What's happening in the south? Well, they got smoked in the Civil War. And we've already touched on the Reconstruction period in the previous period. Not much is going to change in the South. Good rule of thumb is the South changes real slowly. There is some industry developing. The Reconstruction tried to bring in education and some other changes there, so that is occurring. Still highly segregated. Jim Crow era is in full effect by the time you get to the 1890s, and there's just not a lot going on. You got the sharecropping, the debt peonage, the convict leasing, the restrictions to the amendments, the poll tax literacy test. The Ku Klux Klan is doing their terroristic things down there. You do have some efforts for reform. Ida B. Wells is a name worth knowing as she pursues what's called anti-lynching legislation to make lynching a federal crime. Because again, if you lynch an African American in Mississippi, who's going to be your jury, provided you even get arrested? A bunch of white guys. Do you think they're going to convict you? No, they are not. So you make it a federal crime. It gives more protections for people. It's never going to happen, but it is a reform movement that is fought for to make lynching a federal crime. But again, not going to spend too much time on the South. Just understand it changes slow, if it changes at all. The only time, again, worth really mentioning huge change in the South is going to be post really World War II with the Civil Rights Movement beginning, and that's going to be a while. Speaking of civil rights, we're going to have two guys worth knowing, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Booker T is definitely more of a 19th century guy. He advocates accommodation, right? Hey, let's just roll with the segregation that we have. He has what's called the Tuskegee Institute, which is to teach vocational skills. Vocational is a very fancy word for like a job skill. Okay, so a vocational skill today would be automotive repair, being a licensed hair, person who does hair salon type stuff, those types of things, working with your hands, vocational type stuff. Teach you how to do that. And his goal is to get African Americans jobs. You become economically viable, productive, and then you might be accepted by white society. He outlines this in his Atlanta Compromise speech. This gets very much supported by white people because they can point at Booker T and be like, hey, there's a black guy that supports segregation, etc. He doesn't really support it. It's more of a process to achieve equality. You contrast that with W.B. Du Bois, who's like more immediate in his demands. He wants immediate civil rights for everybody. He will help found the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the oldest civil rights organization in the country. He factors more into the 20th century, so we'll see him in the Harlem Renaissance during the early 20th. He has this idea of the talented 10th, the top 10% of African Americans go to school, get the degrees, come back, help the rest of the community. So Booker T, more of an accommodation strategy. W.E.B. Du Bois, more of an immediate demand for equality. But again, both of them trying to find different routes to the same goal of equality and acceptance in American society. And again, like we mentioned, it's going to be a long fight into the 50s and 60s. And even then, just because you get a Civil Rights Act in 64 does not mean that suddenly everybody's kumbaya and equal. The fight for civil rights is a long one. It is still ongoing in the 21st century today and could easily be an essay topic on continuity and change over time of the experience of African Americans or minorities or women. Pick your subset and then give you the years, and then you'd have to name drop a lot of good stuff. So Booker T, W.B. Du Bois, definitely worth mentioning and being able to distinguish between the two. So farmers are getting squeezed during this time period. Costs are going up, prices are going down, railroads are charging them more, etc. They're getting just nibbled at all around by all these different people. So very hard to be wealthy as a farmer. Republicans are going to favor big business. They're going to be predominantly in the North. Democrats are the party of the Deep South, segregation, stuff like that. So neither political party is really wide open for these Western farmers. So they're going to try to organize for themselves. They're going to start with the Grange. You can see what the Grange is there. Then they go to Greenback Labor. This is an attempt, right, to unify Western farmers with industrial workers, kind of the poor classes. Farmers Alliance will come about. And then ultimately, out of all of this, will become the Populist Party. They get their own slide because it's a big deal in American history. This party, they're not going to win anything. Spoiler alert. But we'll talk about why they're important coming up. But this just shows you the evolution of that and why third parties will form, often because the two major parties aren't really doing much for you during this time period. And so keep track of this. The Western farmers will become a political issue going forward. As those farms fail, as those farmers like fail in the homestead or the bank takes their land or whatever, they're going to end up moving to cities because that's where all the jobs are. That's where all the industrial jobs are. Simultaneously, you have a ton of immigrants coming to the United States during this time period. You get off the boat in New York, you don't have a lot of money, you're probably going to end up living in New York. So these big East Coast cities grow. because of immigration, as well as people coming back from the farmlands and stuff like that. So the process of settlement in the United States goes from rural to urban to then later suburban. That's the order in which it goes. Uh, City populations explode. Okay, you're looking at millions of people coming over in a short amount of time, and so the populations just dramatically increase. The cities aren't going to be prepared for it. You have the two different groups of immigrants, the quote good immigrants from northern and western Europe, white, Anglo-Saxon, educated, skilled, England, Germany, places like that. Protestant, traditionally religions, and then the southern and eastern ones, unskilled, Catholic, Jewish, Russian. Those places are going to be less desirable immigrant groups coming to the United States. A lot of them are birds of passage. You come over here, you make your money, and then you go back home. As always, increased immigration equals increased nativism equals restrictions. We looked at the Chinese Exclusion Act already. We set up Ellis Island as a processing place for immigrants coming into the East Coast. So if you're any type of disease, tuberculosis, stuff like that, we can restrict you, send you back. Later on, we get even more restrictive post-World War I when you start bringing in the quota acts and the immigration restrictions because of the communist, socialist, anarchist stuff. Who's going to support nativism? Who's going to support immigration restrictions? The labor unions are going to, nativists such as like the Know Nothing Party, social Darwinists, right? Who's going to want cheap labor, business owners, stuff like that. So who supports it, who's against it? Make sure we're familiar with that. But that list right there is pretty good on who's against it. So during this urbanization process, cities are going to change rapidly. Transportation improvements allows for more efficient movement of people. This also allows the wealthy to distance themselves from industrial centers or poor neighborhoods and places like that. Streetcars, horse-drawn originally and then later electric. Subway trains, big in New York City, for example. Suspension bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge. These are going to allow cities to grow. You couple in there skyscrapers, you can build buildings higher, and you can stack people on top of one another. Early residential suburbs, these are not the suburbs that you would think of the 1950s by any stretch, but it is a suburbanization process that will occur for the wealthy at first and then be extended to the middle class in the 20th century. Touched on skyscrapers. You need elevators as well. No one's walking up the Empire State Building every day to go to work. Ethnic neighborhoods will get formed. You'll have places like Chinatown, Little Italy, for example. Those would be easy name drops for you. But if you want to do like Polish Hill, some other places too, you'll have ethnically Jewish neighborhoods forming in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. These cities, they're dirty, they're dangerous, and they're unhealthy. You've got tenement buildings. You can see in the picture on the far right, stacking up. A lot of times no electricity, maybe running water, depending on what time period you are and where you are. They're overcrowded. You have crime. There's disease, cholera outbreaks, like just lay waste to some of the city populations. All of these will help drive reform movements, though, which are coming. 20th century, you'll see the progressives, muckrakers straddle, right, Gilded Age into the progressive period. Upton Sinclair, dudes like that are muckrakers, and they identify problems, and they're like, hey, we need to try to fix this. But cities are growing, and they're just nasty if you're the working poor. So governments are quickly paralyzed by the number of people that are moving into these cities. City government is ineffective. What city government is there is corrupt because of guys like political machines. They dominate city politics. They're run by a quote boss, a party boss, or a machine boss. The way these work is they help get politicians elected in exchange for political favors and government jobs and money, because the political machines are the ones who can get the vote out. They're very corrupt, but they are able to get things done for a select group of people, their supporters, because the government's paralyzed. They can't do everything. Good government doesn't really exist during this time period. Your go-to example for a political machine would be Tammany Hall up in New York City, run by a guy named Boss Tweed. Another name worth mentioning is Thomas Nast, a very famous cartoonist. His cartoons show up a lot on exams, either stimulus-based, if it's that, or as a document in a DBQ. It tries to expose corruption and abuse. This one is called on the right, called the Tammany Tiger. This is supposed to be the Colosseum, and Boss Tweed is up there above the tiger in red as the emperor, and the tiger has destroyed Lady Justice, torn up the contract of law, and it's just basically it's criticizing Boss Tweed. You don't need to be able to read English to understand a lot of imagery on these Thomas Nast cartoons. So here are some other ones. So this one goes back to, on the far left is Reconstruction. The two smaller ones there, Boss Tweed having like the city beneath your thumb, the government beneath your thumb. The one there, Pacific Chivalry, is clearly a knock at the anti-Chinese sentiment of the West Coast. And then again, in Counting There Is Strength, because these guys controlled the ballot as well. So recognizing Thomas Nast's cartoon style is a quick way to get to the purpose or the point of view of the image. One of your documents will definitely be an image on the DBQ. So being able to derive that, like the intended audience or why the cartoon exists, becomes very, very important. And then if you look here, you can see his signature is very unique too. And if it's a document or something, they'll usually source it for you and tell you it's a Thomas Nast cartoon. So all of those critically important shortcuts to help you get to good points on your essay. So we've identified a lot of problems. So let's talk about how we're going to try to fix these. Reform movements, as always, are oftentimes done by women. So think back to the temperance movement early on, Seneca Falls, and the women's suffrage movement. We're going to add some more reform movements here. We had the Dorothea Dix and the asylum reform, etc. So now we'll add settlement houses to that list. Don't get them confused with tenement houses. Settlement houses are there to assist immigrants, predominantly poor people as well. They'll teach you English, provide childcare, job training skills, help you go get a job. The example you'd want to use for your settlement house is Hull House, run by Jane Addams. The social gospel is also at play here. This is the idea where we're going to take Christian principles and we're going to use those Christian principles to fix the ills of society, going after poverty, different things like that. The whole idea is that you can use your Protestant faith towards social justice. These were your social justice warriors before social justice warriorism was a thing. Again, we'll bring Christianity into the progressive movement of the 20th century as well. You see a resurgence of temperance as well. You'll then see the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, as well as the Anti-Saloon League will be formed for the purpose of limiting and prohibiting alcohol consumption. This is similar to the previous temperance movements and will ultimately see the passage of the 18th Amendment, which is your Prohibition Amendment. And then women's suffrage continues as well. The names again, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, fighting for women's suffrage. Be able to connect this period of women's suffrage to the Reconstruction period and the fight over the 15th Amendment, and then the future success of the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote. A couple of quick slides on culture, right? What's going on in the cities with all these different people, what kind of city culture is being formed. You are beginning to create an urban culture that is unique and distinct from the rural culture. And entertainment, education, whatever, value systems, all of that. Okay, so be able to know the difference between the two. The go-to example in the 20th century would be the Scopes monkey trial or the trial on evolution. Prohibition debates on alcohol, urban versus rural, all of that good stuff. So in our cities, because they are becoming more and more diverse, Catholicism will begin to hey, we're going to create our own schools. You see an increase in Catholicism due to the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Think about the Italians, for example. They are pretty Catholic, considering that the Catholic Church is pretty much headquartered in Italy. Yes, I know it is the Vatican is its own country, but it's in Italy. Cities are expensive. This leads to declining birth rates, so you see changes in families, long hours, child labor, so your kids are working as well in factories now. Divorce rates begin to increase a little bit. It's not anything going to be like 50% or anything like that, but you do begin to see increase in divorce rates, increase in education increases as well. You've got literacy rates there, tax-supported public schools, more people are going to high school, number of colleges increase. They're going to start teaching the social sciences, so you can see the list of them there: psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, that type of stuff. So you're growing jobs and professions, Sigmund Freud and psychology, all that good stuff. So it's a change. More and more people going to school. As you begin to get those industrial jobs and those management jobs, that's going to require higher levels of education. And so you begin to see the demands for education increasing, which is a trend that will continue to grow even to this very day. So in our continuing culture discussion, you've got the arts. So Romanticism is on the way out, being replaced by realism and naturalism. You can see the definitions there. The go-to example would be Mark Twain as the realist in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But again, the whole purpose of this is it's influenced by the industrial period. It's hard work, dangerous, dirty at times in places, scary, world's rapidly changing. not really ideal versions of society as for what a lot of people are seeing. So now with realism, we're going to expose it to like what it really is like. Okay. Naturalism looks at like, the battle within man, man versus nature, stuff like that. Jazz music becomes a thing. So early on, it's African American based music, comes up out of New Orleans, transported with the phonograph and the vinyl records, becomes a deal up in the big cities in the Northeast. So you'd want to take jazz during this time period, the blues during this time period, um, into the 1920s, and then compare it to the rock and roll of the 1950s and stuff like that. You have an increase in leisure time. You have an increase in leisure time because you have technology that does old tasks with less time. Okay. Largely in part because of electricity, as once the washing machine gets invented, as an example, all right, that could be an all-day deal doing laundry back in the day. Now you can put it in the washing machine, walk away, do something else, more efficient with your time, meaning more time to kick back. So you have increase in recreation as well. You've got the circus, Barnum and Bailey, Ringling Brothers. You've got spectator sports. You can see there they are segregated. Baseball is the big segregated one. You have the quote Negro leagues until it's integrated in the 20th century with Jackie Robinson. Then you also are going to have like Coney Island, like amusement parks become a thing with electricity, stuff like that. Coney Island is still in the news every year in America because that's where they do the hot dog eating contest and talk about the most quintessential American contest ever. Let's see how much food we can eat. I'm sure that makes us very popular around the world. Okay, so the Gilded Age, roughly end of Reconstruction to the dawn of the 20th century. You've got the Republicans on the left, Democrats on the right of the chart. Republicans are popular in the North. They're popular with big business industry owners, the wealthy. They're pro-gold. Gold bugs would be the name for them. They are pro-tariff because it protects big business. They're usually Protestant, pro-temperance, and they are extending the legacy of Hamilton and the Whig Party, right? Tariffs, bank, finance, business, stuff like that. And they are the party of Lincoln as well, so freeing slaves, etc. Democrats are popular in the South. They are popular with the urban and political machines of northern cities and immigrant workers, so they do get votes in northern cities, but it's the working poor, the working class. They'll be anti-tariff. They ultimately will be pro-silver, or silverites will be the name there, and that was popular with the debtors and the farmers. Non-Protestant, so the Democrats get those groups as well, and they follow that Jeffersonian tradition of anti-tariff, more agrarian, stuff like that. The Gilded Age is also known for the political parties not having a lot of differences between the two, right? So both parties will be at times like anti-Chinese immigrants, for example, and so few issues really debated. The two big dividing issues of the Gilded Age will be tariff policy, and the other one is monetary policy and what's called inflationary or deflationary monetary policy. Republicans, because they want gold, is what's called deflationary. So you constrict the money supply. That means prices, wages are lower, benefits business owners and people who give loans. Democrats want to inflate the money supply, add silver to it, increase the amount of available money that's in circulation, basically. And this means it's good if you're a debtor, it's good for farmers, prices go up, stuff like that. So those are the two big debates. Weak legislative agendas, really it's all about winning election. How do you win election? Because you're promising jobs to people and stuff like that. So that's kind of the Gilded Age politics, which opens itself up to a lot of corruption, which is why you see political machines and stuff like that as well. And so, as promised, here's your populism slide. Because the Republicans and the Democrats are pretty much paralyzed and they're just really arguing over tariffs and stuff like that, they're not really open to what like the Western farmers' needs and demands are. So populism comes out of the Grange Greenback Labor Farmers Alliance, which we talked about. Begins largely because they're not answering the needs of these guys. And then the Omaha platform. This is the big vocabulary word. It's a list of things that the Populist Party stands for. These are the big ones that you see on the slide. Free coinage of silver. So they're going to be inflationary monetary supply guys. They want added silver. They want a graduated income tax. Spoiler alert, this becomes your 16th Amendment in the 20th century. They want direct election of U.S. senators because it puts more democracy in the hands of the people. That becomes the 17th Amendment in the 20th century. Government ownership of the railroads. Why? Because the Western farmers are getting squeezed by the railroads. They want an 8-hour workday. If you're a Western farmer, what do you care about an 8-hour workday? This is an appeal to the working class in the cities to try to get you on board as well. And then initiative and referendum. So initiative and referendum basically allow you as a citizen to get a bunch of signatures from people who agree with you, and you can vote and pass something into law that does not require a state legislature to pass the bill and then be signed into law by the executive. So one of the goals of populism is to put more democracy into the hands of the individual people. And you see that with the initiative and referendum, direct election of senators and stuff like that. They also kind of want to like target the wealthy, government ownership, railroads and utilities like electric companies, stuff like that. William Jennings Bryan is your go-to example for a populist. He gives what's called the Cross of Gold speech, where he says, you know, you will not press down the crown of thorns upon labor. You will not crucify us to this cross of gold. The picture on the left is an anti-William Jennings Bryan cartoon. You can see him standing on the Bible. When in doubt, if you see a figure standing on the Bible being cheered on by a guy waving an anarchy flag in America, it's usually not going to be pro whatever that guy is. Ultimately, the populists will get absorbed by the Democrats. Usually what you're going to see, third parties will be closer aligned to one of the two major parties. And if the major party is smart, they just absorb that group in rather than see the vote get split. And if you split the vote, you're going to lose an election. So that's really the goal here for this. Democrats absorb populist goals, and well, ultimately populism is done with the election of McKinley in 1896, but you see a lot of goals get accomplished in the 20th century during the progressive period. 16th, 17th Amendments would be examples of that, and some of the business reforms as well. A good rule of thumb in American politics, third parties don't win big. They don't win national elections or anything like that. But usually they get enough support that they push one of the other two parties in a new direction. Okay, and this is going to be a new political party era as we go into the 20th century, as the stalemate gets broken. So that's populism. So make sure we're good on that. Make sure we can compare it to progressivism in the 20th century, and just be aware of its impact on political parties and their goals, etc. This period is also known as the period of forgotten presidents. Why are they forgotten? Because they don't really do much stuff worth remembering. Ask yourself, you ever heard of anybody after number 19? If you have, congratulations. You would be in the minority. So we've got Hayes. He ends Reconstruction. That's all he does, right? For our purposes. He does a lot of other stuff as president, but for our purpose in the exam, he ends Reconstruction in 1877. Ask yourself, how does he end Reconstruction? Make sure you know that. Pulls the soldiers out of the South, promises them a transcontinental railroad. Garfield will come after him. Garfield is assassinated by a guy that wanted a job and didn't get a job, and so he's shot and killed. Chester A. Arthur will sign the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This is meant to limit patronage, limit the whole idea of the government giving you jobs because of your relationship with people, and requires the civil service exam and stuff like that, and have it be more about your competency. Cleveland is the only Democrat of the period, and if you look at the years, he's the only president in U.S. history to serve non-consecutive presidential terms. He continues Arthur's civil rights. He'll challenge the high tariff. Harrison then comes in. He's the grandson of William Henry Harrison. That goes all the way back to Tippecanoe and Tyler II, that election. I was a general, and as the shortest, his grandfather is the shortest president. He's the one who died from pneumonia and stuff like that. He's president during the $1 billion Congress. That's a vocab word. It's the first Congress in the history of the United States to pass $1 billion budget. He will sign the tariff in 48%, which is a pretty high rate. And we'll also do the Sherman Antitrust Act. So the Antitrust Act, again, goes after big business. If you're looking at Harrison and you're like, well, that's kind of interesting, high tariff, but an Antitrust Act, etc., that seems like a Democrat and a Republican idea, you'd be right. So he's thrown out. Excuse me, and that's what brings Garfield back in. And then McKinley, elected in 1896. This ends the populist period. This ends the stalemate in the Gilded Age politics. And this will usher us into the modern American 20th century politics. He's assassinated in the 20th century, and Teddy Roosevelt will take over. But he's very much a big business guy. And so this also will highlight the shift towards like the increasing dominance of urban America. Industry is there. More people will begin living in cities. And the 20th century will grow basically off this urban and industrial foundation, highlighted with McKinley's election. And you can see him there in the bottom right, number 25. So here's this more of your presidents and your political process going from Grant in 1868 to McKinley in 1900. You can see there who does what. You've got the Greenback Party up at the top. You've got the Prohibition Party in the brown down there at the bottom. Again, they're not really going to ever win anything. But you can see who does what, populist in the light blue there. So look at this, a lot of good information on here. Pause the video because I'm sure you're done hearing my voice. I promise we're almost done, just a couple more slides. Check these flowcharts out because there's a lot of good information on the political system and political parties for you. So some other terms here that we need to be responsible for, and this didn't really fit on any other slide, so we just lump them here for you at the end. Munn v. Illinois, Wabash v. Illinois, these go together. Munn v. Illinois was a court ruling that said states could regulate commerce. Specifically, they're talking about grain elevators, but in the broad term, just think railroads in general. It said that the 14th Amendment didn't prevent that or anything like that. So Munn is the green light for states to regulate the economy. The problem is it's going to get overturned by Wabash v. Illinois, and what this says is that states cannot regulate things that are interstate commerce related. Railroads. Okay, so if you're in Illinois and the railroad goes across your state line and goes into another state, you can't regulate that railroad company, is what Congress is saying. So Wabash overturns Munn, puts the ball in Congress's court, saying that they have to pass interstate commerce regulations. And they will. They're going to pass what's known as the Interstate Commerce Act. This will create the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Why do we care? Because it's the first regulatory body for the economy in the history of the United States. And it's weak early on, doesn't have a lot of teeth, doesn't have a lot of regulatory power, but again, it is strengthened into the 20th century to become a fairly strong regulatory agency. And we'll build on this going into the 20th century. So ICC, very important for economic regulations. Another economic regulation that gets passed is the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was meant to break up big-time trusts, monopolies, things like that. They actually will use it against unions early on because, again, remember, business owners and politicians are kind of the ruling group here. It does get strengthened later on in the 20th century, the progressive period. They'll pass the Clayton Antitrust Act, and they'll start breaking up companies. And Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, trust busting guys, stuff like that. That's period 7, but that does occur. We have the Panic of 1893. It's really bad. So we had, again, right, panic of in the 70s, panic in the 90s, panic in the 1920s. Good rule of thumb for economic panics is they always end in an odd numbered year. Okay, so you had the panic of 1819, 1837, then you've got 73, 93, all of that stuff. So 20% unemployment, railroad failures across the country, farm foreclosures, lasts about 4 years. 20% unemployment is ridiculously high. That's Great Depression levels, 20, 25% unemployment. Coxey's Army, these are unemployed guys. They march on D.C. They demand the government create jobs for them. We'll go build some roads, and we'll build the roads, and you can pay us, you being the government. Make work is the phrase you'd want to use for that. The government doesn't do that for Coxey's Army. They will during the New Deal. Okay, and you'll see another group right at the start of the Great Depression, the Bonus Army. These are World War I vets that march on D.C. wanting their pensions early and stuff like that. But the New Deal actually does do make work. The Civilian Conservation Corps, hey, go out and build us nature trails. We'll give you something to do and we'll pay you. The building of the dams and stuff like that. So just stuff for people to do so you can earn a paycheck. Not going to happen during this time period. Laissez-faire is still more dominant during this time period. So the slide you're probably waiting for, the one you just skipped to perhaps, right? What are the potential essay topics that come out of this time period? Well, definitely industrialization. Looking at the market revolution and the late 1800s industrialization, how do those compare? How are they different? How is it a continuity? How is it a change? Causes and effects, this is a major topic. You could see urbanization would factor into those types of essays. Growing change in America, right? American society, urbanization could be a paragraph for you, as well as just analyze the effects of urbanization or causes of urbanization, things like that. Closing of the western frontier, westward expansion, that's a long-running trend in American history. Impact on the natives as we bring the Plains Wars to a conclusion. Continued immigration, although immigration is changing to include Southern and Eastern Europe. Political parties, again, right, what are the new issues as we emerge out of the Civil War period? The effects of populism on political parties, and then the building of the modern America. Our period for period 6 ends in 1898. The Spanish-American War is in 1898. Departure from isolationism begins with kind of the end of this period and the beginning of period 7. You've got populism and then the progressives going into the 20th century. So what are the reform movements doing during this time period? And any type of civil rights you could actually add to this list too. There's not a lot of civil rights stuff going on during this period per se, but we did talk about W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and that would connect you to the 1920s, Harlem Renaissance with guys like Marcus Garvey, stuff like that. But so yeah, so very transitionary period as we build the modern America in this time period. So by the time we get to 1900 in the 20th century, right, the United States is beginning to rapidly look like the America we would recognize, as opposed to the 1860s agrarian, largely smaller city type stuff. So those are the big topics that we've covered during this time period. A lot of them bleed into period 7 or come from period 5, and that speaks to period 6's kind of transitionary. When you look at period 7, which will be the next one, this is the big one. This is the massive chunk of stuff that occurs. I mean, it's only 47 years long, but we go from being a one of several world powers at the end of the French and Indian War, excuse me, not the French and Indian War, the Spanish-American War. Into the Spanish-American War, we are one of several world powers. So just 47 years later, we're a nuclear superpower, equaled really not even, basically equaled by the Soviet Union. Then that's it. There's nobody else on the list. So it's a very transformation time period, right? We've got imperialism in the middle there, that middle picture where you're carving up China, so that'd be open door policy and that kind of stuff. The Roaring 20s, at the top right, World War I, right, ushers in the Roaring 20s. We're going to build the Panama Canal in the early 20th century. Great Depression, New Deal, right, and then finally conclude that with World War II. It's the one that you guys should be most familiar with, but it's also one that has a ton of stuff in it. So make sure you are ready to rock and roll for period 7 and buckle up, because there's a ton of stuff in that period that could easily be on your essay. So I look forward to seeing you for period 7. As always, email me if you have any questions, and we will talk to you guys later.